Good evening. I'm Diane Bystrom. I'm the director of the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics at Iowa State University. And on behalf of the center, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture of the 22nd Mary Louise Smith Chair in Women in Politics, noted economist Dr. Christine Romer. The chair was announced in 1995 to honor the Iowa native and longtime political and civic leader, Mary Louise Smith. The first and only woman to chair the Republican National Party, was a mentor, friend, and role model to many in the world of politics and civic, government, and community affairs. Through the chair, the Catt Center is able to bring prominent women leaders, such as Dr. Romer, to campus once or twice a year to speak with members of the university community and the local communities to inspire us and to engage us in the political process. Dr. Romer's presentation tonight is co-sponsored by the Committee on Lectures, which is funded by the government of the student body and is part of the Women's Leadership Series here at Iowa State out of the Office of the Senior Executive Vice President and Provost. Introducing Dr. Romer is Jared Knight, a junior in political science from Mount Vernon, Iowa. During his time at Iowa State, Jared has been involved in the government of the student body and currently serves as vice president. He also has been active in the University Honors Program, admissions, and in the Catt Center's Leadership Certificate Program. Jared participates in youth mentoring programs in the Ames community, and please join me in welcoming Jared, who will introduce Dr. Romer.
Thank you, Diane. Tonight it's my distinct honor and privilege to welcome Dr. Christina Romer to Iowa State University as the 22nd Mary Louise Smith Chair in Women in Politics. As a professor of economics at the University of California at Berkeley, Dr. Romer is one of the most respected minds in her field and is among the foremost scholars in the area of Great Depression history and monetary and fiscal policy. Her expertise led her to the White House, where she served as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors from January 2009 until September 2010. As chair of the CEA, Dr. Romer met with President Obama daily to design a policy response to the Great Recession. She played a large role in both financial and healthcare reform and shaped budget and macroeconomic policy. She was also the administration's primary spokesperson on the economy and frequently appeared on the evening news, the financial press, as well as Sunday morning talk shows. Along with her professorship at Cal Berkeley, Dr. Romer currently serves as the co-director of the program in monetary economics at the National Bureau of Economic Research and is a contributor to many, many publications, including the New York Times, Bloomberg Television, and many scholarly journals. With the Iowa caucuses quickly approaching and the national political focus centered squarely on the economy, I can't think of a more appropriate time or place for this lecture, and I certainly can't think of a more appropriate person to give it. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome the 2011 Mary Louise Smith Chair in Women in Politics, Dr. Christina Romer.
Well, thank you. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here this evening. It's particularly nice to be here as the Mary Louise Smith Chair on the Thursday night before the first Friday of the month. Now, you ask me, why is that? Well, the first Friday of the month is actually a very big deal if you're the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, because that's the day when the employment and unemployment numbers come out. So tomorrow morning, we'll get the unemployment numbers for November. And one of the jobs of the CEA chair is to actually get all of the numbers that are going to be released to the public on the economy the night before. And so one of my jobs was to let, say, the Secretary of the Treasury or the Chairman of the Fed know if it might be something that would cause a market reaction. And of course, my job was to brief the President as well. So we were inevitably working late on a night like tonight. Now, as you might imagine, when the economy is in the grip of a terrible recession, the employment report is of particular interest. And this actually gave rise to a couple of awkward situations. Now, one, I was only authorized, obviously, to tell a very small number of people what was in the report. But that didn't stop Rahm Emanuel, who was the president's first chief of staff, from starting to call me at about 4 o'clock on the day before the employment report was going to come out. And Ram would pretend to make small talk. Now, believe me, that is not something he normally did. So I would pick up the phone and I'd hear, "So, how are things?" And he was just going to see if I would accidentally let something drop. Another time, I got an email message from the president's body man, Reggie Love, the president was traveling, and he was emailing me to say the president was in his limo, and would I call him and give him the employment report? So I dialed the number, and I hear a very familiar hello, but you can't really say, "Are you the president?" Right? So I proceed to, give him the employment numbers, and I hang up the phone, and I suddenly said, "Oh, my heavens, have I just played into the biggest scam ever and given someone on Wall Street the employment numbers?" So I quickly emailed Reggie, who said, "No, that really was the president that I had been talking to." So the bottom line is I would be delighted to be at Iowa State any night of the year, but I am particularly happy to be here on this particular one and to be the Mary Louise Smith chair and not the CEA chair. All right, well, the Carrie Chapman Catt Center's focus, and the focus of this lecture, is on women and leadership. And this lecture has actually been a chance for me to branch out a little bit and to think about the role of leadership in successful economic policy. And the place I found myself starting is, what do we even mean by leadership? And I think many people tend to think of leadership in pretty narrow terms, right? The ability to get people to follow you, to get people to do what you want them to do. And that's, of course, a part of leadership. But it occurs to me that a much more fundamental issue is not, can you get people to follow you, but where do you lead them? Do you convince people to do good and sensible things? And for this, what matters is much less the leader's dynamism or their powers of persuasion, but rather the quality of his or her ideas. And I think in the case of economic policy, what matters is, does the leader have a good understanding of how the economy works, and policy prescriptions that are based on strong economic evidence. Let me give you an example of what I think is the central importance of ideas in economic leadership. If you go back to the 1930s, I think almost everyone would agree that Herbert Hoover was not a very successful leader on the economy in the early 1930s. And I think it's tempting to think that that's because he lacked personal dynamism or the ability to rally people to his policies. But the truth is, President Hoover was actually quite effective in that narrow form of leadership. He actually got Congress to pass a number of significant pieces of legislation in response to the Great Depression. I think the problem is that President Hoover's ideas just weren't very good, that in the midst of the worst depression in American history, he believed that two things were the most important. One was to stay on the gold standard, and the second was to balance the budget. Now, most economic research, as we were discussing at dinner, actually identifies the gold standard as one of the key sources of the worldwide depression of the 1930s. And it shows that countries that abandoned it sooner, like Great Britain, actually recovered much more rapidly. And almost any macroeconomics textbook will tell you that balancing the budget when the unemployment rate is 25%, as it was back in the early 1930s, is virtually impossible and almost surely counterproductive. And yet one of President Hoover's signature accomplishments was the Revenue Act of 1932, which was at that time the biggest peacetime tax increase ever. So I would argue that his failure of economic leadership was fundamentally a failure of his economic ideas. Well, tonight what I want to do is to talk about the policies taken in response to our most recent recession, which unfortunately I think is appropriately named the Great Recession, because the United States, and indeed the entire world economy, has been through just a horrific downturn. The financial panic surrounding the collapse of Lehman Brothers in the fall of 2008 sent the American economy into free fall. The unemployment rate, as we all know, though I understand it's not nearly as bad here in Iowa, but it has risen dramatically, from less than 5% for the country as a whole before the recession to over 10% at its highest. And this rise in unemployment has hit every demographic group. including the college-educated, a segment of the population that traditionally weathered recessions more easily. But of course, some parts of our society have been particularly devastated. So young people, for example, especially those without a college education, have just been severely affected. The unemployment rate for young people is 25%, and for African Americans, it's 16%. Perhaps even more distressing than the severity of the downturn has in fact been the weakness of the recovery. Though we started to grow in the fall of 2009, hard to believe that was 2 years ago now, growth has been painfully anemic. And as a result, the unemployment rate has just barely inched down from maybe 10.1% to now nationally 9%. And as I said, we'll get a new number on that tomorrow morning. Well, the United States and other countries tried numerous policy responses to stop the free fall and to try to accelerate that rate of recovery. Everything from monetary policy to housing policy to fiscal policy. And I thought what I'd do this evening is to talk about the role of ideas behind those various policy responses. And what I'm going to try to argue is that the key determinant of the actions that were taken was not the politics or the personal dynamism of our leaders, but rather their ideas about how the economy worked. And perhaps even more important, I'm going to suggest that whether policies were successful or not fundamentally depended on the quality of the ideas behind them. That I think sensible, empirically accurate ideas generally led to useful policies, whereas less accurate ideas, I think, have led to policy shortfalls. All right, well, let me start this discussion of economic policy and leadership in the most recent recession with monetary policy, because I think this is an area where we've had some of the earliest and most important actions, where we're even having big actions yesterday, as we've been discussing. And it's an area where I think economic ideas have played just a fundamental role in determining what has been done and what hasn't been done. All right, so first, what has the Fed done to deal with the recession, and how well has it worked? Well, first, as the economy actually started to slow down now way back in 2007 and early in 2008, the Fed did the conventional thing. They lowered interest rates. And in fact, by December of 2008, they'd pushed the federal funds rate, that main interest rate that they control, basically down to zero. In addition to lowering interest rates, the Fed took all sorts of extraordinary actions to try to keep credit flowing. So for example, when nobody was buying commercial paper, the bonds that corporations use to kind of cover working capital and some short-term borrowing needs, the Fed said, fine, we'll create a special purpose vehicle and buy the commercial paper ourselves to try to keep credit flowing in the economy. And I think by almost all accounts, the early monetary policy actions were incredibly important and effective. I think there's actually a good reason why Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Fed, was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year back in January of 2009. What he did through lowering interest rates and flooding the financial system with liquidity helped to stop the panic, which, believe it or not, could have been far worse than it actually was. Now, since the extraordinary actions of late 2008 and early 2009, frankly, I think the Fed's been much less aggressive. They've taken a couple of rounds of quantitative easing. In case you're not up on the lingo, quantitative easing just means that the Fed buys a large amount of kind of unusual assets, things they wouldn't normally buy, like mortgage-backed securities or long-term government bonds. And the idea is to try to push down any interest rates that are already to zero, like mortgage rates or long-term borrowing rates. And the evidence is that those actions have been at least somewhat helpful. But I think in terms of the Fed's own guideposts, monetary policy today is clearly not succeeding. You know, the Federal Reserve Act says that the Fed's supposed to care about both inflation and unemployment. And the Fed's so-called dual mandate. And the Fed has for years said that it thinks inflation of 2% or a little bit less is reasonable, and unemployment should be at its normal, sustainable level, which the Fed itself estimates is about 5.5% today. Right? By those criteria, the Fed is pretty clearly not doing very well. Inflation, the main measure they look at, is actually somewhat below their target, and their forecasts are that it's going to remain there. And unemployment is obviously about twice what the Fed thinks is its normal sustainable level. And it, too, is expected to stay very high for a long time. So how do we make sense of this? What explains the Fed's behavior? Why was the Fed so much more aggressive and successful early in the crisis than perhaps it's been in the past year and a half or so? Well, let me tell you what I don't think it is, right? I don't think it's that the members of the Federal Reserve care more about banks than they do about ordinary people, right? So they took extraordinary actions when the financial system was on the line, but not when unemployment was high. If you read the speeches of Chairman Bernanke and other members of the Federal Reserve, they seem to care passionately about unemployment, and I do believe they're deeply concerned about their failure to meet their dual mandate. Likewise, I don't think the answer has to do with a failure of that narrow type of leadership that I talked about earlier, the ability to get people to follow you. I don't think that the problem is that somehow Chairman Bernanke was a forceful leader in 2008 and somehow has lost his leadership mojo. I think that the key difference, has to do with the quality of the ideas guiding policy. I'd say early in the crisis, two ideas were paramount. One, financial crises are destructive and preventable. And two, credit availability is essential to economic activity. Now, these two ideas are about as fundamental as you can get in macroeconomics. And the research behind them, I think, is well regarded and rigorous. So Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's classic book, A Monetary History of the United States, showed that unchecked banking panics in the 1930s had been a central cause of the Great Depression, and that better monetary policy could have stemmed the panics and prevented the worst economic crisis in our history. Likewise, a large modern literature, much of it written or inspired by Chairman Bernanke's own research on the Depression, showed that credit absolutely is essential to the normal spending of households and the operation of businesses. And if you read the speeches of Fed officials or descriptions of their policy deliberations, it's just clear that these basic ideas drove their response to the crisis. And in my view, the policies were largely successful because the ideas behind them were strong and sensible. But I'd say more recently, ideas are still determining Fed policy, but they're unfortunately somewhat less sensible. So a substantial number of Fed members appear to believe that much of the unemployment that we're facing is due to a mismatch between workers' skills and the jobs available. That is, that the unemployment of 9% is largely structural. In fact, there's a very colorful statement by the head of the Philadelphia Fed, Charlie Plosser, who said, "You can't change a carpenter into a nurse easily, and you can't change the mortgage broker into a computer expert very easily. Monetary policy can't fix those problems." And this reasoning has been repeated by many other Fed members. And I think this view is clearly leading at least some Fed policymakers to oppose any additional actions to help the economy. But I'd argue that it's not very well founded. Those ideas aren't well founded in economic research. Of course, there's always a degree of skills mismatch in a dynamic economy. We're always coming up with new things and new ways of producing them, and that makes some jobs obsolete and others growing. But the evidence does not suggest that there's substantially more mismatch today than there was back when, say, the unemployment was 5% or lower. That most of the unemployment, the research says, that we're currently experiencing is still due to cyclical factors, particularly just way too little aggregate demand, which is something that monetary policy absolutely can help to fix. Even Fed members who don't agree that the current unemployment is due to structural factors have expressed, I think, some questionable ideas about the usefulness of additional action. So if you watched by any chance Chairman Bernanke's recent press conference, he said of additional actions, are those tools likely to be sufficiently effective? Or do they bear costs and risks that would make them less effective and not worth using? I think reading between the lines, they're worried that what they can do just won't be very helpful. I think from my tone, you could probably sense that I don't think that idea, that economic idea, is correct. And in fact, it goes against what I learned from studying the Great Depression. Because in that episode, much like today, interest rates were down at zero, and yet aggressive monetary action absolutely helped It seemed to have made people feel more optimistic, and they started buying things again. They started buying cars and trucks and industrial machinery, and that this helped to foster the recovery. So I'd say the Fed's tools may not be powerful enough to return the economy quickly to full employment while keeping inflation close to 2%, but I do think the evidence from economic history and much of economic theory, it's clear that the Fed could be doing much more at achieving its stated goals. So the bottom line from this discussion is that monetary policy is absolutely determined in large part by economic ideas, and the success of those policies, I think, depends on the very quality of the ideas behind them. Okay, so that's one area of policy. The second one I want to think about is housing policy, right? Because obviously house price movements and housing in general have played a big role in this recession. The rapid rise of house prices just led to an incredible boom in home building and a huge increase in household debt. Then when house prices started to fall in 2007, that put pressure on both homeowners and lenders who were holding lots of this mortgage debt. Defaults rose, home building ground to a halt, and eventually all those defaults led to a loss in confidence in our financial system that was holding so many of the bad loans. And we had the first genuine financial crisis that we've had in this country for a good 2 generations. But you know, the story of how important housing is doesn't end with the collapse of Lehman Brothers back in 2008. Because since the beginning of 2008, there have now been more than 3 million foreclosures, which is obviously devastating families, but it's also devastating the economy and further depressing home prices. Today, another at least 11 million homeowners are what we'd say are underwater on their mortgages, which means they owe more on their mortgage than their house is currently worth. And those underwater homeowners are obviously at a bigger risk of defaulting on their mortgage, but we also think they seem to be hesitant to spend until they dig out from underneath this mountain of debt. And finally, we built so darn many houses in the early 2000s during the boom that we have a significant oversupply right now. So we're not going to be needing to build houses in many areas for, unfortunately, quite some time. So the bottom line is that housing has been and continues to be, I think, a big source of our economic troubles. All right, so what housing policies have we pursued and how well have they worked? And here I'd say the administration absolutely implemented a number of programs, but I think it's fair to say they've worked less well than people had hoped, and I think this has certainly been a source of frustration to everyone in the government, including the president. The main program was the Home Affordable Modification Program, or HAMP. I think one thing we could all agree on, these programs could not have had worse names. But I think what the program did was to try to encourage a servicer or a bank holding a mortgage to modify it to make the payments lower for a troubled homeowner. And the Treasury Department would help them do that by giving them an incentive payment and covering part of the cost. And of about the 4 million homeowners that we thought were at risk of foreclosure and could benefit from this program, only about 1 million have moved on to get a permanent modification. So it's absolutely helped some, but not as many as one would have hoped. The other big housing program is one that allows those underwater homeowners that I talked about to refinance at lower rates. One of the problems was, even as mortgage rates came way down, if your house wasn't worth as much as your mortgage, you couldn't get a new loan. And so the administration has tried to make it easier and change the program so that people who were underwater could still get an interest rate, a refinance at a lower interest rate. And again, about 1 million people have gotten a refinancing through this program, which is a big improvement. But again, I think we'd been hoping that more like 4 or 5 million people would be helped. Now, importantly, essentially none of these existing programs do much of anything to get rid of that negative equity, right? What we don't have is any kind of a widespread program where we actually write down the principal on a mortgage that's underwater. And that's kind of very different than what we had, say, back in the Great Depression, where we did have a program that did that. And as a result, one of the things that's going on is there is just a whole lot of negative equity out there. If you want to put a number on it, American homeowners as a group owe about $750 billion more on their mortgages than their homes are currently worth. So that's a lot of negative equity. All right, so what accounts for the housing programs that we pursued and what I think we'd agree was their somewhat limited success? Why was this path taken and not others? And here, too, I can tell you from firsthand experience that ideas were just incredibly important. So my colleague at the Council of Economic Advisors, Austin Goolsbee, played just a tremendous role during the transition in formulating our housing policy. And at that time, what the best academic evidence showed was that very few underwater homeowners actually defaulted. Most people that even if they owe more on their house than the house is worth, keep making their payments, they stay in the house. And what you find is that what pushes people over the edge, what actually ends up pushing them into default, is usually something bad happening in their life. They lose their job, somebody gets sick, there's a divorce. And so what this analysis suggested was that if we wanted to reduce foreclosures, the important thing to do was to reduce mortgage payments for these people that get into trouble, to help them get through these rough patches. And so that was the logic behind that beautifully named HAMP program that lowered people's payments if they got into trouble. Well, one of the things that we ran into that actually went into where we had trouble was in the implementation. It turns out it was a good idea, but we had very few carrots and even very few sticks by which we could make financial institutions actually modify people's mortgages. A more fundamental limitation is, I think, we designed a program that only focused on part of the problem. So we were focused on preventing foreclosures, and that's absolutely very important. But I think new research shows that household indebtedness matters even separate from the risk of foreclosure. In fact, here I'd tell you about some great new research by my colleague, Atif Mihan, and his co-author, Amir Sufi, who look at household debt and household spending across all the counties in the United States. And what they find is that consumers in counties that had a big run-up in household debt before the crisis have been much more hesitant to spend, to buy cars, to do home repairs, all those things, than people living in counties, probably like a lot of the counties in Iowa, that didn't run up those big amounts of debt. And what it appears to be the case is that heavy debt loads and negative equity really do seem to be a bigger problem, I think, than economists had realized. And it suggests that policies need to be more focused on reducing principal on troubled mortgages and less on just reducing payments. Now, I don't actually think it's the government who should absorb this negative equity. So that, as we described, would be really expensive. We're talking $750 billion. And as we discussed at a meeting with some of the students this afternoon, I'd be nervous about spending a whole bunch of government money on people who are at least rich enough to own houses, right? So they're already at the upper part of the income distribution. But I think there are some very sensible ways that we could encourage or even force financial institutions to do the write-downs on their own dime. For example, we could modify the bankruptcy law to allow judges to modify mortgages. Right now, they can write down the principal on a car loan or other loans, but not on mortgages. It seems to me housing is a case where policy was driven by sensible ideas, but implementation problems reduced its effectiveness. And it's a place where new research suggests that the driving ideas may have been too limited. And certainly what I hope is that policy responds to this new research and the emerging consensus that principal write-downs are desperately needed. All right, well, that's housing. We've done monetary policy. I've saved kind of the biggest one for last. That's the ever-popular fiscal policy. Because fiscal policy refers to anything having to do with the government budget, whether it's tax changes, spending changes, anything that affects the budget deficit. It includes these measures that are aimed to help to reduce the unemployment rate, the so-called fiscal stimulus, but it also covers spending and tax changes to deal with our long-run budget problems. So let's start with what we've done with fiscal policy since the Great Recession started and how well has it worked. And here I'm going to branch out a little bit and talk not just about the United States, but also some other countries, because As we know from what's going on in Europe, fiscal policy is a huge issue, not just in our country, but obviously in the troubled countries of Europe, and even in a number of emerging economies, such as China and Brazil. Fiscal stimulus was an absolutely essential part of the policy response to the Great Recession. And here, I think it's important for people to realize it actually started in the Bush administration. The Economic Stimulus Act of 2008 was signed way back in February of 2008, actually just 2 months after what we now date as the start of the recession. And it provided a tax cut for about $1,200 for a typical family, much of which came in the form of a rebate check mailed to families that year. Now, President Obama obviously continued the fiscal response. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 was passed just 1 month after his inauguration. And at $787 billion, it was the largest countercyclical fiscal stimulus in American history. Now, one thing that people may not realize is it took various forms. Roughly about a third of it was more tax cuts. About a third of it was spending increases on things like infrastructure and renewable energy. And about a third of it was payments to either state and local governments to help them through the crisis, or to people who'd been directly hurt, like through unemployment insurance or supplemental nutrition. Importantly, many other countries also took aggressive fiscal action. So Germany, for example, had a very aggressive program of paying employers to keep workers working, but the government would carry the bill. China spent about $600 billion on infrastructure, which may not sound so big until you realize they're only about a third as big an economy as we are. So that's really a huge number. And I think the best available research points strongly to the conclusion that all that rapid fiscal stimulus worldwide played an important role in stopping the free fall. In fact, a really interesting study that we did at the Council of Economic Advisors looked at the outcome across countries. And what we found is that countries that did more fiscal stimulus, like China, Korea, Japan, actually did better relative to what people had been predicting before the stimulus than countries that did a lot less, like Italy and Switzerland. And in that study, the U.S. was kind of in the middle. We did a moderate amount of stimulus given our size, and we did moderately better than expected. Now, the notion that the Economic Stimulus Act of 2008 and the Recovery Act of 2009 were helpful in the United States has actually been backed up by a number of recent studies. One of the few silver linings to this terrible cloud that we've been living under is that there's been a blossoming of new research on macroeconomic policy, and especially on the effects of fiscal policy. And almost all of it finds that expansionary fiscal policy does increase demand and increase employment relative to what it otherwise would have been. For example, a really nice new study, that Economic Stimulus Act of 2008, a nice new study found that people actually absolutely did spend it. And in fact, many of them behaved like my father, who I remember was waiting for his check to come in the mail and then immediately went to the Honda dealer and bought a new car. Believe me, the check did not begin to cover it. Likewise, there's several studies that show the Recovery Act had an impact. So for example, I'll just give you one, but a study by Daniel Wilson, who's at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, looked at the variation in Recovery Act spending across states. And what he concluded is that the Employment Act raised employment, or the Recovery Act raised employment relative to what it otherwise would have been by about 3 million as of mid-2010. That, not surprisingly, is music to my ears, since I predicted it would raise employment by roughly 3 million. But it's nice to see it confirmed by a very different kind of study. Now, since the Recovery Act, the United States has taken a handful of additional actions, but so far we haven't done another big round of fiscal stimulus. And indeed, both here and in the United States, and especially in Europe, much of the focus of fiscal policy has really changed from stimulus and reducing unemployment to concern about the budget deficit. You know, the Greek debt crisis, which, again, hard to believe we've been living with this nightmare for now almost a year and a half. It began back in the spring of 2010. I think that helped to wake everybody up to the fact that many countries, including our own, are not on a sustainable fiscal path. So many advanced countries, both here in Europe, Japan, are looking at just enormous budget deficits going out as sort of that dual problem of the baby boom generation retiring and rising health care costs come together. The response in many European countries to the Greek debt crisis and concern about the deficit was to move immediately from fighting the recession to dealing with the deficit. And country after country cut government spending and raised taxes. Now, some countries like Greece and Spain and Portugal basically had no choice, right? If they wanted help with their debt crises, places like the IMF and other European countries said they had to cut their budget deficits. But others, like the United Kingdom and Germany, chose to do this because they thought it was the best policy. And I think the outcome in countries adopting what we'd call a strong fiscal austerity, that immediate aggressive deficit reduction, I think, frankly, has not been very good. If you look at the true problem children of Europe, right, they find themselves caught in just a terrible circle. So a country like Spain, where fiscal austerity causes unemployment. When unemployment goes up, tax revenues go down, so their budget deficit doesn't actually fall. So then they have another round of fiscal austerity. And what we see happening in a country like Spain, but you could put in Greece, you could put in Italy, you could put in Ireland, is that what you see is their unemployment rates have gone up. And hard as it is to believe, the unemployment rate now in Spain is some 22.6%. And their deficit, you won't be surprised, is a disaster precisely because of it. Now, here in the United States, we're talking a lot about the deficit, and heavens knows we're fighting a lot about the deficit. We're not actually doing all that much. You know, this summer, the President and Congress eventually agreed we were going to reduce our deficit over the next 10 years by about $2 trillion. And then we learned just before Thanksgiving that the super committee that was set up by the legislation to actually figure out how we were going to reduce it by $2 trillion couldn't come to agreement. So our long-run fiscal situation is still very unsettled. Well, once again, we can talk about where these various fiscal policies came from. And once again, I think the evidence points very strongly to a central role for economic ideas. So take those first two big fiscal stimulus actions, the tax rebate under President Bush and the Recovery Act under President Obama. Now, in both cases, the president's leadership was important. So having watched the process up close, I know it takes a lot to shepherd even a pretty popular bill to completion. So I don't want to sell short the persuasion and the personal leadership that both presidents provided. Likewise, in the case of the Recovery Act, the two women senators from Maine, Susan Collins and Olympia Snowe, I think both also showed extraordinary personal leadership. They made a very tough decision to support the Recovery Act despite the opposition from their party's leadership because they thought it was the right thing to do. But I think a far more important source of these actions were, in fact, the prevailing economic ideas. Again, it may feel hard to believe this now, but given how acrimonious the discussion of stimulus has become, but one of the most widely accepted principles of economics is that tax cuts and increases in government spending can help to heal a troubled economy. Indeed, one of the things that the economics team did when we first came to Washington in December of 2008 was to just call a large number of respected macroeconomists of both parties to ask them what we should do. We figured we could use all the help we could get. And what we found is that Republicans and Democrats differed some in the form of stimulus that they recommended. So Republican macroeconomists tended to like tax cuts more, and Democratic economists tended to prefer increases in government spending. But there was incredibly widespread support for aggressive fiscal expansion. Likewise, ideas played a key role in why the rest of the world passed aggressive fiscal stimulus as well. But importantly, ideas have also played a huge role in why it's been stopped. You know, here in the United States, if you are listening to any of the discussion, it's clear many policymakers have become convinced that fiscal policy, fiscal stimulus, doesn't work to create jobs. And believe me, I understand the temptation, right? You say, we spent $787 billion and the economy is still weak, so obviously the stimulus didn't work. right? But where that reasoning fails is that it doesn't take into account the fact that the economy was headed into a tailspin when the act was passed. So it could still have been very helpful, even if we still have a long way to go before we're fully recovered. And as I described, a number of careful studies have in fact concluded that the stimulus did work. Now in Europe, ideas have changed even more radically. A key idea that took hold there is the notion that a fiscal contraction can actually be expansionary, right? That is, that getting the budget deficit down could actually raise output. And the mechanism is supposed to be a confidence effect, that people would be so reassured by the improvement in the deficit that the private sector would take off. And you can see why this idea is very appealing to policymakers. They could deal with both their problems at one time, right? High unemployment, the budget deficit, all we have to do is get the deficit down, both problems will be solved. And it caught on very strongly, particularly in the United Kingdom and in Germany. I think the main problem with the idea is it just doesn't seem to be right. Now, one study thought they'd found this in the data, but a much more careful study done by the IMF actually showed pretty convincingly that fiscal contractions were, in fact, contractionary. Right? And what they did, they used budget documents to identify every time they went through 15 countries over 30 years, identified every time the countries were actually trying to do a fiscal contraction. And what they found is not surprising to most macroeconomists, that output typically fell and unemployment rose after such fiscal contractions. Now, actually, back in May of 2010, the administration was actually pretty concerned about this spread of this notion of expansionary fiscal contractions and the move to fiscal austerity in Europe. And we were afraid it could derail the recovery. And so actually, Secretary of the Treasury Geithner and I went to Europe to try to convey the message that maybe countries should, take turns or a more varied approach rather than everybody moving immediately to austerity. Now, as an aside, I will tell you that the flight itself was a bit of an adventure. So we were flying in a military plane with unfortunately had one lovely cabin. And though we were both cabinet members, believe me, the Secretary of the Treasury outranks the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, because his position was created in 1789 and mine wasn't created until 1946. And that meant that he got the bed. Well, at one point on this flight, we actually hit terrible turbulence, and I saw Tim's security detail rush to his cabin. Now, being a nervous flyer, when they came out, I stopped them and said, "What's wrong? Is the plane going down?" And they said, "No, we were afraid the secretary might have fallen out of bed." So I figured it was justice. Well, when we got to Europe, what we tried to explain was that fiscal austerity might absolutely be necessary for some countries, particularly those with the largest deficit or under attack by financial markets, but that other countries like the United States and France and Germany could wait until the recovery was more formally established before they got their budget deficits down. We clearly weren't very successful because austerity has continued to be the main policy prescription in Europe, and frankly, I think it's not working. To my mind, what's desperately needed both in Europe and here in the United States is a much more comprehensive fiscal policy based, frankly, on better, more accurate ideas. Because fiscal stimulus does help an economy grow in the near term, I think there is a strong case to be made for doing another significant round, as the president has suggested. At the same time, I feel strongly we can't just ignore the deficit. The budgets for the United States and frankly for lots of other countries are on a completely terrible and unsustainable path. And you just have to look from some of the projections coming out of the Congressional Budget Office to know that this is a problem that absolutely has to be solved. But I think a sensible way to deal with both the fact we have high unemployment now and a terrible budget deficit over the longer term is to pass a comprehensive plan that has more stimulus now, but also a plan to get the deficit down gradually over time. And we should make that decision right now. What spending are we going to cut? Whose taxes are we going to raise? But then we should phase in the actual contraction only gradually as the economy actually recovers. That way we'll be able to do what we need to do for the economy today, but we'll reassure everyone, I think including ourselves, that we'll be solvent over the long haul. Well, the key message of my talk this evening is that When it comes to economic policy, I think ideas about how the economy works are just a key determinant of policy actions. And the success of the policy depends on the soundness of the ideas. And that has certainly been true of the policy response to the Great Recession. Monetary policy, housing policy, and fiscal policy actions have all had their roots in the prevailing economic ideas. And the policy responses that have been most successful when the ideas behind them are based on strong empirical evidence and careful economic theory. So what does the key link between ideas and policy tell us about leadership? Well, to my mind, what it suggests is that true leadership is indeed much less about personal dynamism and the ability to motivate others. It's about the strength of one's ideas. It's about where you lead people, not just whether you can get them to follow you. And I think this view of leadership has implications for universities, such as Iowa State or Berkeley, where I teach, and that train so many of our future leaders. I feel we need to instill in our students a passion for ideas and a deep respect for evidence. I think we can do the most to train them to lead by training them to think and to never stop learning. Because I think the ability to critically evaluate ideas and empirical evidence is a skill future leaders need most to acquire. I think this view of leadership also has implications for all of us as voters. Each one of us needs to learn to look past the superficial attributes, such as charm and charisma, and we need to focus on a candidate's ideas. I think in the realm of economic policy, we need to demand that our potential leaders explain their views of how the economy works and ask them to defend the soundness of their ideas. Well, early on, I somehow got pegged as the optimistic member of the economics team. And I still haven't forgiven the San Francisco Chronicle, who wrote an otherwise very lovely profile, but then put the headline, Obama's Sunny Economic Forecaster. Personally, I just think anybody looks cheerful next to Larry Summers. It's not that I don't see the difficulties facing our economy. Of course I do. Our economic challenges, as I've described, are larger than they have probably ever been since our parents or even our grandparents were born. But my optimism comes from a belief that sensible policies can indeed help to solve our economic problems, as long as they're based on sound ideas and rigorous evidence. More fundamentally, I think my optimism is born actually of a very deep respect for American voters, who I think are hungry for a serious discussion of our economic challenges and an honest debate about economic ideas. And for all our sakes, I hope that candidates from both parties will give voters the straight talk and the substantive discussion of economic ideas that they so desperately need and deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Romer. I think that was all not only very informative, thought-provoking, entertaining, and really does say, as Jared said in his introduction, really sets us up, I think, for the Iowa caucuses and the important role Iowans play in maybe holding these candidates more accountable for their economic ideas and their understanding of the economy. We're going to take some questions from the audience. As you can see, Pat Miller back there is by the center mic. When you ask a question, please keep your questions as brief as possible so that we can take as many questions as we have time for. And then following the question and answer session, you are all invited to join us at the back of the hall for refreshments. So we'll get started.
Okay, this may not be brief. I'm going to address the role of women.
Okay.
I've read Ron Suskind's book carefully and between the lines. And I think you alluded to it a little bit. All right. There were some strong women in this administration or within government at the time. Sheila Bair, Elizabeth Warren, previously Brooksley Born, yourself, and probably some others. It's not really clear that they were all treated very well. But secondly, it seemed that the women could be straightforward in their criticisms and be direct, and you were apparently direct on a few occasions, which are quoted in the book. All right. So is there something about the role of women in this administration which meant that they played this kind of role? And does it say something about the kind of role women can play in administrations, which are serious and not crackpot, so that they bring something that is different from the men? Because it's very clear that Susskind could have followed this theme in his book because he kept referring to these women. And as you know, Brooksley Born and I think Sheila Bair got the Profiles in Courage Award at the Kennedy Library. Thank you.
Sure, that's a great question. You know, I think I told at dinner tonight, certainly based on what I know and the discussions I had with Ron Susskind, he gets many things wrong. But the one anecdote that he did get right was my interchange with Elizabeth Warren. He actually describes, you know, frankly, from what I'd read and heard, I was a little bit nervous about hiring her. And so I actually had asked to meet with her. And we had a very intense hour back and forth where actually she just blew me away. And I actually became one of her biggest supporters. But in the course of that, we had exactly your same discussion of people like Sheila Bair, Brooksley Born, and all of that. And I did say something to the effect of, why is it always the women that do seem to stand up? And it was a little more colorful than that, so but I won't repeat that. But the main, and you know, that's a gross generalization, because I met lots of brave men, starting with President Obama right on down. But I was impressed at the degree to which the women I worked with were not afraid to stand up and to say what was right and what was true, sometimes in very difficult situations. You know, what I think, and so I, you know, and actually I'll give you another example. I mean, so the other thing that has often struck me, and again it's a crude generalization, is the degree to which, you know, women can work together. And I see this somewhat in Congress. I was quite struck. I spoke recently at a women's Senate network, and what was striking is the degree of mutual respect between the Republican and Democratic women senators. And, you know, I think that's how the whole Senate used to be at one point in time, and I think that's a model for all of us. In terms of what's true in the White House, you know, I think someone described it very well as saying the women have lots of power and they feel kind of crummy. And I don't know if that is, so it's absolutely the case that Nancy Ann DeParle was absolutely central in passing health care reform, and Carol Browner played an incredibly important role on climate change, and I absolutely felt listened to on economic policy things. So I think women were front and center in the biggest policy decisions being made. And I think, you know, some of it is, you know, I think just some of the personalities in the White House, you know, just, I'm not sure it was anything to do with gender. It's just somehow maybe it bothered us more. And one of the things that really struck me, when the president got a sense that that there was an unhappiness or concern, I remember it vividly because he called a dinner with about 10 of the senior women in the administration and said, "What can I do better?" And I think, isn't that what we'd all want in our boss, for someone to say, I see what might be a problem, or at least it's a problem I want to nip in the bud. And I think he tried to be, you know, very proactive and make us make sure that we felt valued and empowered. So, you know, I think what I have trouble disentangling is it's a tough environment. You know, before I ever went, somebody said, there's a lot of testosterone in the West Wing. I think it's traditionally been a tough environment. I think, if anything, what's different this time is there's so many women there that actually we were a critical mass. And after a while, we actually told the president we didn't need to meet with him. We needed to meet with one another. And we started going out together and actually sort of having that form of mutual support. But, you know, it's an issue I think we face in our society. We want all the best people in policy positions, and that means empowering, you know, a cross-section of the country. And I think it's important to make sure that we do that. Yes.
My question for you is, you know, you were the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and that's obviously a position that requires you to be in the political realm quite a bit. What advice would you give to someone if he or she were coming into that position like yourself, an academic, how do you prepare for that kind of world?
I'm not sure you ever can. I mean, one of the things that was nice about being, I mean, anyone who's in the administration has to be somewhat political. One of the things that was a blessing for me, I think the CEA tries to be sort of the least of the political. I mean, that very much I tried to always argue from the evidence and not just, kind of say, oh, those Republicans, bad ideas, right? It's actually trying to stay balanced. And I think that's really important for the CEA chair, and to actually to not get too much drawn into political things. I think the general rule for the advice I'd give someone is the advice I think I'd give anybody going into a position, that as much as you can, right, that argue from ideas and argue from evidence and not impugn each other's motives. Actually, I'll tell you one of the funniest things. It's almost my husband who took this the worst, right? So when people would write things, it just make him so mad. And especially when there was someone, a very distinguished economist, who wrote something about, well, it's clear Christina Romer doesn't actually believe this stuff, but she had to make up numbers. And just like David wanted to strangle him. And so the way he ended up dealing with this, he started writing letters where he'd, I can't believe you. And then, thank heavens, he'd show it to my chief of staff, who'd say, David, that's a fine letter. You can't send it. But anyway, I think that actually is probably really good advice, is to say, kind of think about how it makes you feel when someone impugns your motives, impugns your values, rather than argues with you on the facts, on the evidence, or what is it about the theory you don't like. Let's talk about that. Let's not talk about, I think you're a bad person. And I think that's the best advice, both how you react to people and how you deal with it, is to say, there must be something wrong with them because I'm not a bad person, and we're going to just assume they were having a bad day. But it definitely is tough.
Thank you.
Dr. Romer, we're hearing lots of debate going on yet today about what caused this huge downturn in 2007 and 2008. I'm hearing it's people on Social Security, it's Medicare, it's people that got homes that couldn't afford them, and then you hear, well, the banks did it, and I know that the banking people are still doing extremely well, are making more money than they ever have. So what is your take? What has caused this mess we're in?
That's a great question. I think the first thing I want to take off the table, it's not Social Security and it's not Medicare, right? That is something that's certainly a part of our long-run budget problem. I won't tell you that that's not a big part of why, looking forward 20 or 30 years, it's hard to imagine how we're going to pay for everything because more people are retiring and healthcare costs are going up. So that's a problem, and frankly, we are going to have to either as a society say we're going to rein those things in, or we're as a society going to have to say, okay, tax us enough to pay for it. What isn't going to be okay is to say, let's still have all those benefits and not pay for it. That's the thing that can't be on the table. But it's not the reason we're in the terrible recession that we're in. As I suggested, I think, the proximate cause is absolutely the bubble and bust of housing prices. And what that did to the bubble caused a whole bunch of overbuilding. It caused people to take on a lot of debt. It caused banks to make a whole lot of questionable loans. And then when prices came down, all that kind of worked in reverse. That suddenly people were defaulting, banks were having trouble because they had all these bad loans, and people have all this debt and they don't want to spend. So that's kind of the proximate cause. How you divvy up blame, like should banks have, of course banks should have been, more cautious. Our regulators, I think, let us down. So somebody should have been watching the banks more closely and saying, boy, this only makes sense if house prices always go up. So I think that gets some blame. And surely there's some homeowners that get some blame, that were taking on mortgages that they probably couldn't afford, may have known they couldn't afford. There are certainly some unscrupulous lenders who were encouraging people to take on loans that they knew they couldn't afford. So I think there's plenty of blame to go around. You might put a little blame on the Federal Reserve. Maybe they kept interest rates too low for a while, and that's part of what caused housing prices to go up. So there's, I think, like many serious things, There's no one culprit. I mean, I often tell people, if you're an economic historian and you go to cocktail parties, someone who doesn't know anything will say, so tell me what caused the Great Depression. And you start to say, well, do you have an hour? Because there's no one simple answer. And that's the same, anything as bad as what we're living through now, it's not going to surprise you that there are a number of factors that are mattering. I think for where we are now, the thing that frustrates me is so much of the political discussion is about things that I don't think are really the cause of our problems. So where we are now, we just have a huge shortfall of demand. We just really aren't demanding enough to keep our factories all going and everybody employed. And why we're not demanding enough, some of it is we built too many houses, so nobody's building houses, so that's a big chunk of demand that's gone. We have these over-levered consumers, so they're hesitant to spend, so that's part of the problem. And businesses are still kind of nervous, I think mainly because they're looking at Europe and saying, oh my heavens, what's coming down the line, right? So they're not doing much investing. Instead, what everybody's talking about is, what we need are more trade agreements, or what we need are, worker training. And those things, actually, I support both those things, but they're not going to get the unemployment rate down from 9% back to 5%. Those are things that'll be good for our long-run growth. When we're back to normal, I'd love to talk about those and doing more of those, but I want people to be saying, let me tell you how I'm going to get millions of Americans back to work, because that's really the fundamental question, and I feel that's a lot of what's been missing in the discussion.
First of all, thank you for coming, and thank you for your work with the CEA. My question is, can you talk about a forecast for how you see a recovery playing out, especially with our current focus on austerity and things like that? Do you see a path back to normal?
Oh, see, this is when I wish I could be optimistic, Christy.
I was hoping that was going to continue here. But
I mean, the sad thing is, it is very hard to see an optimistic scenario for where we are now, right? So that basically, I think the most likely outcome is we putter along like we're doing now for at least another year or two. And so, this time next year, if we're lucky, the unemployment rate is in the mid-8s rather than, 9% as it is now. And, to me, that's just like, I can't imagine, the president of the Chicago Fed is my current hero. Of all the monetary policymakers, his famous line is, we should be acting like our hair is on fire, right? And that's kind of how I feel, that 9% unemployment, we should be acting like the world's coming to an end and not saying, well, maybe we can deal with the budget next year, right? It's just like, it's an incredibly horrible situation. But my best guess is we're not going to do very much. So we're not going to do more fiscal stimulus. I don't see the Fed actually gearing up to do something more dramatic. And now we've got this giant Europe sitting out there, which, if we're lucky, won't implode. So just the number of, we have lots of things holding us back and nothing that I can see actually, giving me a lot of hope. So rather than let me try. So if I want, so that's my point estimate is, if we're lucky, we don't get worse, is kind of my fear. If I wanted to be optimistic, so if I was going to try, what is a little bit surprising is, despite all the things that are going on in Europe, the last month or two, we went through a really rough patch this summer with the debt ceiling debate and the downgrade. The numbers have been surprisingly good since then. Like, consumer confidence has come back up. Black Friday, by all accounts, was like a really good spending. So maybe, despite all of our guesses, American consumers are saying, heck, I think the world's going to be okay. So that's the one thing that could be a source of hope, so that if we see that happening, that could help things. Another thing, maybe, just maybe, the Europeans will get their act together. So I was talking at dinner earlier, about the only path forward is if the European Central Bank says, okay, we're going to buy a lot of Italian debt, we're going to buy a lot of Spanish debt, we're going to get these interest rates stabilized and help these countries. If they do that, and they kind of have, I think most people think we got like a month, and if they do that, that could maybe be a lot of help. So you could imagine the optimistic scenario is we keep having a good holiday season, the Europeans finally do something. There was as I was walking through the Denver airport last night, I saw Republicans might be supporting the president's suggestion of expanding the payroll tax cut, so maybe we'd get a little more fiscal stimulus. So you can, it's not without hope, but I don't have a lot, is I'm afraid the truth.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Romer. Thank you so much for being here this evening. And I guess one part of your talk that I really appreciated was your focus on ideas, and I think that's something that's certainly lacking in our current discourse. And so I was wondering, during the course of the internal deliberations within the administration on how to deal with the crisis, was there ever a situation where even amongst the experts like yourself, it wasn't very clear what the best idea was? Or was it always a situation where, well, you guys knew what the good idea was, but it may not be politically feasible to implement? So were there ideas where it was like, we really honestly don't know what's best?
That's a great question, and absolutely there were times when we didn't know what the best idea was. And, again, I'm not going to be telling any secrets. We fought like cats and dogs, right? That there were differences of opinion about the evidence, and to the degree, I actually, Larry Summers and I have a complicated relationship, but the truth is, I admire him deeply, and I often describe the thing that made me feel best is when he decided I was worth arguing with. Right? That was like when he decided he didn't have to just, not listen to me, that we actually would fight back and forth. And so in terms of concrete things, probably the most concrete fight we had was in the fall of 2009. So it's not a big one, but it was about, so here Larry and I were on the same side about wanting more fiscal stimulus, but we were disagreeing about what was the best way to do it. Right? So I think Larry was on the side of let's just do more infrastructure, and I was kind of worried that was pretty expensive and tended to be slow. And we'd done a bunch of research at the CEA. So here's just an example of what a good policy process is like. We had swung into action, gotten data, written computer programs, all this stuff, trying to say what we thought a new jobs tax credit would do. So we got kind of excited that maybe a very cost-effective way to get a lot of employment was maybe if we gave employers an incentive for hiring. And it's actually a part of what the president proposed in his American Jobs Act. He has a payroll tax cut for employers, but tied to the increase in your payrolls. If you increase your payrolls, you put people on, or you raise people's wages, then you get the tax cut. And that was an example where there wasn't much, research on that topic. And Larry was determined that it wouldn't be helpful, and I had, my staff had done these things, and we thought it would be. So, and that's one, we still don't really know because we haven't really tried it in a big way. But that's a place where even the experts, doing the best that they can, came to a very different conclusion. So it's not always easy. Sometimes, I think on the big picture on fiscal policy today, I feel at some level it's easy, right? We need kind of both fiscal stimulus and a really sensible, probably a Bowles-Simpson kind of grand bargain on the long-run fiscal situation. That's kind of a comprehensive package, and I would think you'd probably get a lot of agreement among both Republican and Democratic macroeconomists that would be a sensible policy. It seems to be impossible politically, but that's one where the experts kind of line up and say that makes a lot of sense. And it just can't seem to get done. But there are certainly others where there's a lot more disagreement, and even people with very good values and good interest in ideas just come to the evidence and read it a different way. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Romer. You kind of started answering my question just now, but kind of as a young person, just watching the news and going to be out on my own, a full-fledged citizen in a couple of years, all I seem to hear is that there's so much gridlock and we can't seem to get anything done in Washington. So we might have a surplus of great ideas, but it seems like there's no way to accomplish those ideas. So I just was wondering if you see any sources of kind of hope or any ideas for what we could maybe change about the structure of Washington, and so maybe we start getting some things moving forward.
An incredibly great question. At some level, right, I was so lucky, right, because I was in Washington kind of at the beginning of the administration when things actually passed. You know, my husband tells the story, my very first economics paper, so if you're a professor, right, you have to write papers and it goes to journals. And my very first paper, I sent it to a journal and it came back, we love this, we want to publish it. Never happened after that, right? So normally you send a paper to a journal, first it gets rejected, then somebody says, well, if you change it all these ways, you know. Well, I felt the same about the government. The first thing I felt really strongly about, the Recovery Act, we worked on it. A month after we were there, it's passed, it's law. And I thought, this is great, right? You know, this is how the world's supposed to be. And it's obviously not like that. The reason for that story is, I mean, obviously sometimes Washington does work, right? So sometimes people do put aside partisanship and all that things, and they just do what's right. And that's why, you know, when I really meant what I said about we never would have gotten the Recovery Act if the 2 Republican senators from Maine hadn't said, you know, we're convinced and you've changed it in the ways that we thought were important, so we're going to support it. And so the question is, can we get back there? I think the best answer is the fact that this is a democracy. And I think at some point, no matter how much politicians want to have a spitting match, they have to listen to us. And so I think as a young person, I think the main thing is to demand that they actually do the stuff that you think is important and they talk to you about their ideas. You know, it's not a short-run fix. It takes time, but I think that is ultimately the main power that we have. So the main thing is I love coming to Iowa. Precisely, no place in the world or in the country do people take their politics as seriously and actually have the discussion about ideas with politicians. And so I think I think the main hope is that people like you and every one of us says we're not going to take it anymore and you've got to solve our problems. That's why we put you there. So.
All right, we're going to take one more question.
I was going to say, Diane, I didn't expect you.
Here I am back. I've had plenty of time to ask questions today. We're going to take one more question, and then I do again invite you to join us for some treats in the back. But here's our last question.
This question,
not to feel any pressure or anything.
This question may be coming from left field, but how do you feel about the U.S. involvement and the role and the efficiency in investing in development projects abroad, specifically with foreign aid and global health initiatives?
That is certainly a change of pace. You know, I think the most important thing is, I think from the fact that you're asking this question, you're an informed person that understands. I think the surveys where most Americans think we spend, 15% of the budget on foreign aid, right? In truth, the numbers are very small. And if anything, I think anyone who looks around the world at the amount of suffering there is in many places, certainly from my point of view, that seems money pretty well spent. So I certainly know that we have huge problems here at home, and we obviously need to be taking care of Americans. But I think we can also, all of us in our personal lives desperately care about people that are suffering in Africa or other countries. So, I think the important thing is to think about how to spend that money well. And we were talking earlier today, I think one of the really neat areas of economics these days is the research on development spending. What's the best way to help a country help itself? And, the research of things like, how do you get farmers in Kenya to use fertilizer? What's the thing that helps them the most? Is it credit? Is it information? My colleague, Ted Miguel at Berkeley, did some fascinating work on, if you help children in Africa get rid of worms, do they stay in school more? And he actually, worked with a non-governmental organization to do an experiment where you kind of randomly assign people and found it mattered, that it really improved people's lives. I think that kind of research is very helpful in thinking about any money that we are going to spend, how do we spend it in the way that actually helps people the most? And that is I think, something where the evidence is what matters, right? It's not just, what do you think or what are your politics or whatever. It's actually, the ideas, what seems to work, what's the evidence, and then following those. So, all right, well, thank you. It's been such an honor to be here, so thank you.